Okay, so you'll recall that in Chapter 6 we discussed Hume's problem of induction, as well as some other contemporary problems of induction as well. The new riddle of induction and the Raven paradox. Well, the problems of induction are essentially epistemological in nature, which means that they ask how we know. You know that already. With induction, the question is how we know we are discovering law-like regularities as opposed to generalizations that just happen to be true, what we sometimes call accidental generalizations. Well, in this chapter, DeWitt continues examining the idea that science reveals the laws of nature, but now the question is not epistemological but metaphysical. The question is, what is a law of nature? In other words, what properties really distinguish a law of nature from an accidental generalization? Now, epistemological and metaphysical questions are different, but they're connected too. Now, we mentioned this earlier in the semester, but it's worth restating. When we were studying theories of truth, we noticed that the nature of truth is a metaphysical question, whereas how we know what is true is an epistemological question. But we also noted that if a view about the nature of truth implies that truth is inherently unknowable, we tend to count that as a flaw in the theory. That, we learned, is a standard criticism of the correspondence theory of truth. So if we developed a view about the nature of natural laws that implies that natural laws are inherently undiscoverable, we'd also tend to count that as a flaw in that view of the nature of natural laws. The reason in the case of truth, as well as the case of law, is we begin with the assumption that we actually have discovered some truths and some laws. So we're trying to build an understanding of these concepts that's compatible with those assumptions. As an analogy, imagine that an early scientist is trying to develop a theory of, say, thunder. For example, Aristotle proposed that thunder is the extinction of fire in the clouds. When we later realized that there is no fire in clouds, we did not conclude that there is no thunder. We just concluded that Aristotle's theory of thunder is wrong. I said we tend to count this as evidence that theory itself is wrong because we don't want to be dogmatic about it. It may just be true that there are no laws of nature, or maybe it's true that natural laws exist, but we can never know whether we've discovered one. These are intelligible positions and ones we might have good reasons for accepting. This sort of thing happens in science too. For example, during the medieval period, everyone believed in witches. A scientist who came up with a theory of witches, according to which witches did not exist, would have been burned at the stake as a witch. But we eventually did conclude that there are no witches, not simply that our theory of the nature of witches and bewitchment was incorrect. It just turns out that we don't require a theory of human behavior according to which some people have the power to cast magical spells on others. Similarly, it may be that we do not require a theory of scientific inquiry, according to which scientists have the power to divine natural laws. Well, one reason for thinking this actually might be the case is that our primary notion of a law seems to derive from the social world. In the social and legal sense, laws are rules that you either follow or break, with possibly unpleasant consequences in the latter case. This basic notion of a law might be adequate to an animistic or anthropomorphic conception of nature, which we've already discarded, but it's not adequate to a mechanistic conception of nature. On this view, nature itself has never heard of, say, the law of gravitation. It does not follow it, and therefore could not break it. There's certainly no guarantee that the concept of law can be adequately naturalized. It may just be that the requirement to behave that we built into our understanding of social laws has no satisfying analog in nature. It may be, in other words, that the idea of natural law is just a pleasing and useful metaphor. Or worse, It could be just a sneaky way of transferring authority from one domain to another. This is actually the Humean view, not the part about transferring authority so much, but David Hume concluded there is no such thing as natural necessity, partly based on the insolubility, in traditional terms anyway, of the problem of induction. Okay, so on to DeWitt's analysis. DeWitt first introduces a useful distinction between natural laws, laws of nature, and scientific laws, and he's mostly going to be talking about the latter. So according to DeWitt, we conceive of the laws of nature as the fundamental rules governing the behavior of the universe. Perhaps we ultimately aspire to discover laws of nature, but none of the scientific laws we've so far discovered have that degree of generality. Properly informed by initial conditions, natural laws would describe the behavior of all phenomena in their domain perfectly, and we do not have anything like that remotely at hand. And when we call something a scientific law, we're making no such claim to universality. Rather, we're just saying that we have captured some sort of objective, exceptionless regularity for some well-defined sort of phenomena in the observable world. It's important to understand that when we call a scientific law exceptionless, we do not mean that it has no ceteris paribus conditions. Ceteris paribus clauses are just unless conditions that imply that the regularity does or may not hold in some specific case. So when we call a scientific law exceptionless, what we really mean is that when no ceteris paribus conditions apply, it will always hold. There will be no unexplained exceptions. Now, DeWitt discusses two important ideas central to the notion of a scientific law. The first is that scientific laws are exceptionless, and the second is that scientific laws are objective. I'm going to discuss these in reverse order. The objectivity of scientific laws. Well, for the purposes of this discussion, DeWitt characterizes the term objective as indicating that something is not in any way dependent on the existence, choices, actions, preferences of human beings. This basic idea of objectivity is what underscores realism. The facts are what they are, regardless of what we believe them to be. Minimally, then, laws are general facts subject to the same realistic interpretation. This notion of objectivity has some interesting and perhaps regrettable implications. For example, strictly speaking, it implies that there can be no scientific laws of human behavior. After all, human behavior depends on human existence. It's not clear that DeWitt himself intends his concept of objectivity to rule out scientific laws of human behavior. I think what he principally means to rule out is scientific laws about things that make essential reference to human interests or purposes. For example, DeWitt points out that because chocolate mousse is an invention of humans, and therefore would not have existed if humans had not existed, chocolate mousse is not objective, as he is using the term here. But you might say, well, every physical object in the universe is contingent in exactly that way. Why single out chocolate mousse? Well, the idea is basically this. Chocolate mousse can't actually be understood strictly in terms of its physical and chemical properties. To really understand what chocolate mousse is, you need to see it as something created by humans to satisfy specific human purposes, that is, dessert. This can be a little confusing because we want to say, surely chocolate mousse is, in the end, just a certain complex mixture of naturally occurring chemicals. And that's right. The claim isn't that chocolate mousse has some spooky, non-physical stuff mixed in with the chemicals to give it that yummy mousse essence. Now, some philosophers would argue that chocolate mousse is something that is inherently made by humans, so that if the universe, for example, were to randomly produce an object that was physically identical to chocolate mousse, to the ones that human makes, to the chocolate mousse that humans make, it would not actually be chocolate mousse. That's a slightly different point, one that would apply to any object, in fact, in which we think the manner of its generation is essential to what it is. For example, these same philosophers would argue that if we were able to create something physically identical to a human being by assembling its chromosomes molecule by molecule in the lab and then growing it in an incubator, that it would not be a human being. They insist that humans are essentially things that are sexually reproduced by other humans. Well, in any case, DeWitt's point about chocolate mousse is not about what it is made of or how it is generated, but rather how we humans conceive of it. DeWitt doesn't use the term here, but sometimes we express his point by saying that chocolate mousse is not a natural kind. A natural kind is a grouping that exists in nature and does not depend on or reflect human concerns in any way. There are plenty of things that seem to exist in nature, but which will not be natural kinds or objective in DeWitt's sense of the term. For example, in a certain sense, weeds are out there in nature, but weeds are not objective natural kinds because a plant is a weed only insofar as humans find it undesirable. Constellations do not exist objectively in nature either, because constellations are just groupings of stars that reflect human apophenia and the inclination to tell stories. So anytime we're talking about an object whose very definition requires reference to the purposes and goals of humans, we're not in the realm of objectivity in the sense required by scientific law. Although DeWitt doesn't note it here, this sense of objectivity is what most people have in mind when they deny that social science could ever result in the discovery of scientific laws. Which makes perfect sense, since social science is the attempt to study those very human institutions and practices that are by definition not objective in DeWitt's sense of the term. So, for example, economics studies the distribution of goods and resources like real property and money, which obviously do not exist in nature, but are entities that represent human values. It's a short leap from here to the claim that economics and other social sciences are not sciences at all, and many philosophers actually do claim that. However, DeWitt is not claiming that, since he is not claiming that all sciences discover scientific laws. In fact, in this chapter, he's not saying that any of them do. Well, scientific laws is exceptionless. On the surface, the idea of an exceptionless regularity would appear to be pretty transparent, but there are interesting problems that arise in trying to be precise about it. The main problem is that scientific laws are not just regularities that have been exceptionless so far, but regularities that will remain exceptionless in the future because they are, in some sense, necessary. For example, there are no purple tigers, and there may well never be any purple tigers, unless we decide to make some, but it's highly unlikely that this is prevented by natural law. DeWitt explores one popular way of defining an exceptionless regularity, which employs the idea of a counterfactual. Now, a counterfactual is an if-then statement, a conditional, of a particular kind. Specifically, the if clause describes something that does not obtain, that runs counter to fact. So, if I had stepped out into the street just then, I would have been hit by the bus. If you had asked her out on a date, she would have laughed in your face. If I hadn't taken this class, my semester would have been ever so much less stressful. As an aside, it's worth noting that the human ability to entertain counterfactuals is one of the most important differences between humans and non-human animals. Human beings use counterfactuals as ways of doing thought experiments about the future. Basically, we can say, I wonder what would happen if I did this. And often we can figure out a pretty good answer to this question without actually doing it. This not only keeps us out of a world of hurt, but it allows us to make and implement sophisticated plans, like going to the moon or making dinner for a friend, which will involve anticipating all sorts of counterfactual contingencies. The reason counterfactuals seem like a good way to explicate the notion of a scientific law is this. When we think about a regularity that just happens to have been exceptionless so far, we can state counterfactual conditions that would falsify it if they occurred. For example, yes, there are no purple tigers, but if a tiger cub had been born with a particular mutation on a particular chromosome, then there would have been at least one purple tiger. So this is not a scientific law. Well, this leads us to a notion of a scientific law as an exceptionless regularity that resists counterfactual falsification, that in other words holds true under a wide variety of counterfactual situations. Suppose that someone says that Dana only eats pizza. You're dubious, so you ask, well, what about breakfast? What if she's sick? What if she's at Taco Bell? What if she's invited to dinner? What if she is crash landed in the jungle and starving to death? What if she thinks something is pizza but it isn't? Of course, we don't have natural laws about individuals, but you get the idea. The more the claim resists counterfactual falsification, the more we'll be convinced that it's exceptionless. Similarly, you can't counterfactually falsify Newton's law of universal gravitation by just imagining that the Earth or our sun never existed. What if the Earth never existed? What if the sun never existed? What if our solar system never existed? Well, Newton's law of universal gravitation would still hold. If it's a law, it's because its truth does not depend on any particular facts like these. Well, it seems like a very promising way of understanding natural laws, and many sophisticated versions of this idea have been explored. But as DeWitt points out, there seems to be a basic property of counterfactuals that will prevent it from ever being entirely successful. This is what DeWitt calls the essential context dependence of counterfactual statements. The basic problem is that the truth of any counterfactual relies on specific background assumptions. For example, reconsider, if I had stepped off the curb just then, I would have been hit by the bus. Well, the truth of this claim depends on the world being configured in a particular way and all sorts of things not happening that could in a specific context. Someone could push you out of the way at the last moment, or a tie rod on the bus steering system could break and take it suddenly off course. So this is just the familiar phenomenon of ceteris paribus conditions, and in fact, the first time DeWitt himself has mentioned them. Importantly, lots, though not all, ceteris paribus conditions will make reference to contingencies resulting from human plans and actions. When they do, this of course conflicts with the notion of objectivity DeWitt has already introduced and found relatively unproblematic. Well, okay, fine, you might say, but what about when they don't make reference to human interests? Surely natural laws are the ones that resist counterfactual falsification at a level well beyond the puny sphere of human interest. Well, that's actually a good point. And here DeWitt gets a little more abstract. For example, he notes that Kepler's second law has all sorts of ceteris paribus conditions. Here's one. A planet in an elliptical orbit will sweep out equal areas in equal times unless it collides with another object. Which at first just seems to make your point, right? A collision with another planet is a perfectly objective matter. Certainly doesn't make any special reference to human interests. Well, what DeWitt says here is yes, that's true, but the problem is that a collision with another planet is just one of an infinite number of things that could interfere with the elliptical orbit of a planet. In fact, although DeWitt does not mention this, we humans could theoretically be interested in doing this and blast it out of its orbit using nuclear weapons.
I say we take off and nuke the entire site from orbit. It's the only way to be sure.
But what DeWitt says is that since the list of ceteris paribus conditions is too long to specify, we're forced to use some expedient, specifically the concept of similarity. In other words, we'll specify a short list of such conditions and finish by tacking on the phrase, and other stuff like that. But here DeWitt points out that likeness or similarity are not objective notions. In some ways, apples are like oranges. In other ways, they are not. Whether we assert one or the other depends on what aspect we humans happen to be interested in. So DeWitt's fundamental point is this, and it's an interesting one. When we try to be precise about what it is to be exceptionless, it looks like we end up being drawn back to the sphere of human interest, which conflicts with our notion of what it is to be objective. Well, do scientific laws exist? This chapter is just a very cursory review of attempts to define scientific law, but the fact is that no such attempt has met with wide acceptance. This, combined with epistemological issues raised by the problem of induction, has led many philosophers of science to agree with Hume and to suggest that the idea of a scientific law really isn't necessary for understanding what scientific inquiry is or for appreciating its value. This would be in keeping with a generally instrumentalist and fundamentally pragmatic attitude toward the value of scientific theories. We would claim not that science is in the process of discovering immutable, exceptionless laws of nature, but simply that science has so far just been the approach that has produced the best results in helping us to predict and control the future. Of course, as we discovered in our discussion of the problem of induction some time ago, this can't itself tell us why we absolutely ought to continue to do science in this way. Any reasoning that appeals to the past success of science as a reason for continuing it in the future will presume the principle of induction and, presumably, some realistic commitment to the notion of natural law.